I always find it slightly disconcerting that as we make our way through one of the Gospels, in our case at the moment, Mark, we suddenly switch to John. It's long been recognised that the Gospel of John is significantly different to the other Gospels. It has characters and events that the other three don't, and it lacks stories that are prominent in the others. We're all used to the first words of John heralding the start of our church year. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then bang, we're into the life of Jesus as he starts his ministry around Galilee. By the time we're 2/3 of the way through the first chapter of John, Jesus is starting to gather his disciples. John's also different from the other Gospels in that it's full of signs. Not the messages of the parables we've become used to, but rather in the form of Jesus' actions and words. John doesn't use the language of miracles or wonders, because he wants us to understand that these things are beyond themselves. They're signs of God's kingdom. And it's just as important that we pay attention to them and we understand them. John just picks the highlights, like the 2 healing signs that are in the previous chapter to the one that I've just read. That's the official son of Cana who he healed, and the man by the pool who'd been ill for 38 years. Excuse me. They are just a small sample of the incredible things that Jesus has been doing for the sick, and it's because of these signs that the crowd are following him. We are told that sometime after this, Jesus takes the disciples of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus takes them up the mountain and sits down with them. In the other Gospels, we read that Jesus took them there to escape from the crowds. But here, today, no sooner has Jesus sat down with his disciples than he looks up and sees the great crowd that's been following him. In Mark's account of this story, we're told that he saw the crowd were like a sheep without a shepherd, and he had great compassion for them and began to teach them many things. John tells us that Jesus' compassion was for the immediate physical needs of those in the crowd. Even while they're still gathering, he's concerned for them. He turns to Philip. Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? Of the 12 disciples, Philip is the natural one to ask. He comes from Bethsaida, a nearby town. If any of the disciples know where they might get food, then it's going to be Philip. John is like someone telling a story who can't help but put out spoilers, dropping hints about what's about to happen. He's probably not the sort of person you'd want to go and watch a film with. He wants to be clear in verse 6 that Jesus already knew the answer to the question. Jesus is aware of our needs and is more than capable of meeting them, even before we know what they are or how to ask them. Jesus was aware of the crowd's needs. He already knew what he was going to do, but he asks the question to test his disciples, to see how far they've come in their faith. And quite frankly, they didn't do so well. Philip stumped. He can only think of the immediate economic problem of trying to buy enough bread for the people. The situation's impossible. There's no way it can be done. Just then another of the disciples, Andrew, comes forward. He's been canvassing the crowd, checking out what's available. And he's managed to find a young boy, the only one who's had the foresight to pack a lunch. Not that what the boy had was much. All he's got is 5 loaves and 2 fish. John makes mention that these are barley loaves. We might think it's a pretty good meal. But in Jesus' day, barley was cheaper than wheat. It's a poor person's meal. And he wouldn't be carrying a nice piece of salmon. It would probably be 2 small pickled fish. Andrew is driving home Philip's point. There's no way they can feed the people. What little they have is laughable. But Jesus is undeterred. He tells the disciples to get the crowd to sit down. And then quite simply, without pausing and without concern, Jesus takes what little they have and gives thanks for it. John doesn't labour the point. He doesn't make much of it at all. He doesn't even record the words that Jesus said. Then he starts handing out the bread and fish, and he keeps on handing it out. Everyone who's there, all 5,000 plus, gets something to eat. The crowd is fed, they eat their fill and are satisfied, as much as they wanted. There's even leftovers. Although the food was miraculously provided, it came from nowhere and it cost nothing. Jesus doesn't let it get treated lightly. He doesn't let the food go to waste, but rather demands that it be collected up. 12 enormous baskets. Now the 12 baskets might be symbolic in that they bring to mind the 12 tribes, the sign of a new kingdom. But it might also be that there was just one basket for each of the disciples. But there's more to the sign than that. With such a great crowd, it's unlikely that everyone who was there saw or heard what Jesus did. But word travels fast, and you can imagine that as they ate, the people started talking about what had happened. They knew that something amazing had taken place. They knew this was a sign, and they understood what it pointed to. And John gives us some clues to help us understand the significance of it when he said, "Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near." The fact that it was near the time of the Passover, when many Jews would be travelling to Jerusalem, doesn't just help explain why there was such a great crowd wandering the wilderness. It helps us understand what this sign was pointing to. The Passover is the greatest of the Jewish festivals. It's a celebration, a memorial of God's amazing deliverance of his people. It was a time when the Jewish people looked back and remembered how God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, how Moses had led them out of Egypt, through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. When they remembered God's provision for them as they wandered in the wilderness, how he gave them manna, bread from heaven. But the Passover wasn't just a time for looking back and remembering, but also looking forward. They would have remembered the promise God delivered through Moses in the wilderness. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet, like me from among your own people, and you shall heed such a prophet." You can imagine them chewing over this in their minds as they chewed on their bread by the Sea of Galilee. You can imagine them saying all these things, seeing the connections, starting to interpret the signs. This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. Their expectations, their hopes were high. Here was the one Moses had promised, one who would follow in Moses' footsteps, who would deliver God's people once again. These expectations were filled with the hope for the Messiah, a king of David's line. The 5,000 men Jesus has just fed would make a sizable army. They're ready to snatch Jesus, quite literally, to seize him and make him king. They're ready to have him ride at their head as they march on Jerusalem, throw out the Herodian pretenders to the throne, and drive out the Roman rulers. The crowd only got the sign half right. Jesus had come to be king, to deliver his people, but he came to bring an even greater deliverance than Moses. He didn't come physically to deliver one nation at one time. He came to offer an eternal deliverance for all people, in every age. He's not about to allow the crowd to manipulate him, to force him to do what they want. Instead, he quickly sends his disciples off, so they won't be caught up in the crowd's wild thinking. So rather than having them jumping on the bandwagon, Jesus packs his disciples in a boat, sets them sailing across the Sea of Galilee, while he slips away through the crowd and retreats to be with God. Jesus catches up with the disciples in the middle of the night. They haven't fared too well. They've only made it 3 or 4 miles across the Sea of Galilee, and they're caught in one of the storms that the region is prone to. The sea is rough and they're battling against it, when Jesus casually walks across the waves towards them. John tells us they were terrified. They can't understand what they're seeing. And Jesus knows their fear. He knows their confusion, and he did with the crowd. He has compassion for them. He stills their fears with the words, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Seeing the trouble the disciples have been in, knowing their needs, Jesus performs another quiet miracle. As soon as he steps into the boat, they immediately arrive at their destination on the far shore. In like fashion, Jesus knows the needs of the world and calls us to join him meeting them. If the disciples had had their way, they would have turned the crowd away to fend for themselves. But Jesus calls us not to shy away from the needs of those around us. He didn't expect the disciples to solve the problem, and he doesn't expect us to single-handedly solve world problems. Instead, he invites us to offer what we have and promises to take what we offer in faith and to trust him to use it to achieve great things. Amen.